Thank you for joining for this episode of the TechSpective Podcast. I have with me Jeff Mann, who I've spoken to before, and he and I previously worked together. But Jeff, if you'd like to give a little bit of background on yourself.
I'll try to make it quick. I've been in the information security, now cybersecurity business for over 40 years. I've come to start referring to it as since the late 1900s, since the Gen Zs kind of get a kick out of that. Sort of cut my teeth working for the Department of Defense. I spent 10 years at the National Security Agency from about 1986 to 1996, which was kind of a pivotal, transformative time in terms of our history and especially in terms of technology, where we were transitioning from an industrial and signals kind of, everything's radio and Morse code and a little bit of satellite and a little bit of TV and telephone to what we now experience as the digital age. So I was there kind of cutting my teeth not only on what we now call cybersecurity, but just witnessing some of the growing pains or transition pains of NSA as it was shifting gears from being the one-stop shop for everything crypto-related within our government to competing at some levels against public key, cryptography and schemes and so on and so forth. There's stories behind all that I tell in various places and at various conferences, but suffice it to say, I left in 96. I've been in the private or commercial sector ever since, doing primarily consulting with lots of different types of companies. I've actually been doing what's called PCI, the payment card industry. I know that's what we've talked about before, for 20 years. It came about in 2004, and I've been doing it since 2004. And it's recently it's a love-hate relationship. I guess it's always been a love-hate relationship. But what I love about it is it gives me an opportunity to go to different organizations and see different things going on and try to help them figure out how to do the right level of security. I kind of view it as a puzzle, and the pieces are different. Although the problems are usually the same, it's the politics and the organizational structure and things like that are different, which make it fun. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell. I do a lot of public speaking at mostly security and hacker conferences because people like to hear stories about the old days, especially the NSA war stories. We might end up telling one or two here. You never know. But yeah, that's me.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because I know you, and without listing names, there's probably like 5 or 6 other people I could think of off the top of my head who I've known for a while, who are former government intel of some sort, who then went on to found companies or join the cybersecurity industry, and I would say that increasingly in the last like 5 years, I swear like 3 out of 4 conversations I have are with an Israeli founder who is former Unit 8200. Like every cybersecurity vendor now is started by someone who is former Unit 8200. Yep. And I think you and I have talked about this in the past, but I always find that somewhat interesting from the standpoint of feeling like it's perhaps maybe a little hopeful, because on the one hand, I look at, like I put the NSA on this pedestal. I have this mythic view of the NSA as these elite cyber hackers who can crack everything. Mm-hmm. And from that mythology, I then say, well, if you're willing to come out of the NSA and then say, well, let me go help defend things, I'm like, all right, well, at least you think they're defensible. Mm-hmm. Because I can just as easily see someone coming from Unit 8200 or coming from the NSA and saying, yeah, I'm going to go do something else entirely because this is a no-win situation.
The Kobayashi Maru.
Yeah.
There's an ancient movie reference. Yeah, it's the mythology aspect of NSA is very interesting because, for years, NSA didn't even acknowledge its existence. When I started working there in 86 was about the time I guess it sort of roughly corresponded to the end of the Cold War, frankly, which was what, 88, 8 or not 89. I grew up in Maryland. I never knew that NSA existed, and it's in Maryland, Fort Meade, Maryland. But the mythological aspect, I think, is something that NSA kind of relies upon historically as a way of disinformation. Right. They're fine for you to think that they're uber hackers and uber this and that and the other, and can do tremendous things, and maybe they can, maybe they can't. But if you think if you think they're capable of that, that's probably good.
I was going to say that the other example I would give of that, and it's a more real world physical example, is the Russian military. And so, like, prior to 3 years ago, I thought the Russian military had all these capabilities, and that they had this impressive fighting force, and they had this impressive military technology, and by invading a foreign nation and putting it to the test, they've unveiled to the world that they weren't quite what their mythology led us to believe. Like, right. their military seems to be somewhat inept and run down.
Right.
So,
well, I think that analogy works up to a point, because I still am of the opinion that the U.S. military is pretty capable, and the last few months notwithstanding, very well-funded and focused, and with trustworthy leadership and so on and so forth. I feel like it's a transitional point where, I was reeling, as long as many of my former peers last week, when we got the news that the director of NSA and the assistant director had been summarily fired. We were all kind of having these jaw-dropping moments. I'm on an email mailing list with former employees of the Information Assurance side of NSA, IA, and there's been the collective chatter on that was, WTF, and there's people on there that started at NSA in the 60s, which by my math means they're probably in their 80s, on up to youngsters like me, early 60s. But I was reading an article today that somebody posted that talked about the traditional view of the director, because the director of NSA has always been military, and the assistant was the one that was civilian, and the rationale was very much structured like a military organization, where the head, the director, is rotated every couple of years, but for the stability and the carryover, that's where the assistant came in. So that many thought, in a lot of ways, that the director is kind of a figurehead role, that the real work and the real behind the scenes stuff is the deputies. And the person that was posting this was asking the question, with the recent changes, has the perception, if not the reality of that, been sort of flipped upside down? Because apparently there's talk about putting a civilian person in place as the head of the National Security Agency, and who is also currently head of the U.S. Cyber Command. Probably should throw that in as well. There's also a lesser known but still public fact that person is also the head of what's called the Central Security Service, whatever that is.
Well, okay, so all of that, I think is it gets to kind of what I'd really like to talk about more, which is there's over the last 10, 20 years. There was a shift of like, I don't know, if you go back 20 years, there definitely was like the government's over here doing their thing with cybersecurity, and private sector's over here doing their thing with cybersecurity, and right. The government didn't involve themselves in private sector cybersecurity. You have things like North Korea hacking Sony, and there are things that started to like blur the lines of like, well, okay, but if it's a nation state adversary that's going after the private sector, then whose job is that? And there's the whole sort of philosophical discussion of the United States government does provide military defense of the nation. They don't expect the state of Texas to provide its own air defense. They don't expect me to provide my own air defense. And so like cybersecurity can be viewed in the same way, and and the trajectory is that it increasingly has. And there's a lot more private sector, public sector cooperation. And when I look, if you had asked me 4 or 5 years ago, I probably didn't realize. I probably heard of it, but didn't really know about CISA. But under Jen Easterly, CISA became like a huge thing, and I think that became a thing that everyone really looked to and relied on and respected, and that was a great source of information and collaboration. Given all that's happened recently under this administration, with firings and replacing people that are leading agencies and such, I'm curious your thoughts on like what is how are you interpreting it, and how do you think the cybersecurity industry should interpret it in terms of like is that alliance with the federal government kind of on pause? So should cybersecurity companies like stop relying on the federal government for collaboration and intelligence?
So many layers to unwrap in that series of questions. I will start by saying, when I was working for the government and when I left the government, CISA did not exist. Department of Homeland Security did not exist. These organizations came about after 9/11 in 2001. Or so, I don't know how soon they were founded afterwards, but they're all as a result of 9/11, as is the Patriot Act, and as is the infrastructure of laws that were put in place that got NSA in trouble a few years ago with the Snowden revelations and WikiLeaks and all that. It's funny, when I was at NSA, and we didn't call it cybersecurity, we called it information security. We were kind of the experts because we were kind of the only ones that did it, and, primarily for the military. There was some sense of, I guess, data security from, large enterprise organizations that were out there that had networks that were or were not connected on the internet yet. But then there was everybody else. But, back then, NSA did have the expertise and did have the knowledge and I worked with tremendously brilliant people at NSA, not the usual smoke and mirrors that you sometimes get with quote unquote cybersecurity experts. It's you and I play in the media. You know who I'm talking about sometimes. And one of the things that I've not liked seeing over the last couple of years as I meet with people and talk to people that are still affiliated is the shift from the sense of the expertise being in the government versus being out in the private sector, where the kind of the rubber has hit the road, and private and commercial companies, they do it because if they don't, they get breached and they lose money, or they did get breached and they don't want it to happen again. They kind of cut through the bureaucracy and the conservativeness that I found was part of my experience at NSA. So, fast forward to today, our society in general, when it comes to cybersecurity, I see this with my clients all the time, and going to vendor exhibitions at the big conferences. There is this sort of belief that security is somebody else's problem and not mine, either within an organization or within a county or municipality or state, and then on upwards to the federal government. So I get that there's this sense that, the government should be doing a lot to protect a lot of things on behalf of its constituency, which flies in the face to some degree of what's happening with, if you look at a very, very high level and squint and don't look too closely, it seems like a lot of the actions that are being taken by the current regime is to follow through on the Republican ideal of small government and pushing everything out into states' rights. I don't know if everybody anticipated that states' rights also meant the federal government's no longer going to pay for stuff that they've paid for in the past, that it's on you, the states, to cough up the cash and the resources and do it yourself. That's where I kind of like look back and like, I wonder if people were thinking through that logically, what the outcome was going to be. And of course, that feeds right into the cybersecurity thing, because there's, one of the common themes of urgencies the last couple of years is critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure is very often owned by some level of local government or municipality, which is notoriously always underfunded. Government in general typically, is not funded as well as the private sector, and, from the federal government on down. So I don't know who's thinking they're going to be able to do it. I don't know where they're thinking the money's going to come from. You mentioned CISA sort of building a reputation. A lot of what they were doing was providing resources to the country, organizations and municipalities at various levels, and it was kind of provided for free, if I recall correctly. NSA has had in place similar types of programs. I don't know if they felt like they were competing with CISA or were complementary. Knowing what I know about that part of the government, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that there was some sort of friendly competition going on, and competition in particular for funding. And it wasn't that they're for-profit companies, but they're for getting their budgets approved so they can keep doing what they do, type of thing. All that's apparently been blown up, and I have no clue how it's all going to fall out. But at a high level, I'm trying to be objective and breathe through it. I have the knee-jerk reactions like everybody else, especially hearing that the director of NSA gets fired. I'm trying to be objective and see, what the grand scheme is, what the end game is. I'm not necessarily over optimistic, but if it's getting all the things that you've been relying on ripped away from you so that you learn how to be self-sufficient, whoever you are, at whatever level of government you are, or whatever level of private sector organization you are, maybe that's ultimately a good thing. I would in general say that the idea that security is somebody else's problem is a fallacy in how most organizations approach their cybersecurity programs. I think that's one half of a two-sided coin where I think most of the problems are, because for the trillions of dollars that have been spent on cybersecurity, the number of breaches and the number of lost data sets and so on, the numbers keep going up and up. Despite everything that's going on, the numbers keep rising. So we're clearly not doing something right. So having the rug ripped out from under you, trying to figure out how to do something differently, maybe that's a good idea, but nothing has worked seemingly so far.
Hold on though.
Sure, go.
I guess first I would say I have had that conversation in the past, like many years ago, where I was like, hey, every year we spend more money. Every year the attacks go up. There's just you can follow the lines. They just go like that. And I was like, so are we just failing year after year? And I don't remember who I was talking to, but they did point out, they were like, yes, but you're talking about also a moving and expanding target. So we spend more money to fight the threat landscape of last year, but meanwhile the threat landscape and the attack surface keep expanding. So we have to again spend more money, and they'll be. And so that part does make sense to my brain, but but you make a very good point. I mean, there's like I wrote a thing a couple years back, like a long report for a vendor about the state and local cybersecurity grant program, and how, like that, how state and local governments, kind of relied on being able to get these funds in order to do the things they need to do. And I do agree with you on some level. If I step back and I try to be purely pragmatic and take away my knee-jerk response to this administration, I can say, okay, well, is it a bad thing for a state or local government to have to go back and figure out, how do I take care of myself? How do I fund these things? And I agree that from a pure what should be Republican ideology, that kind of makes sense. I mean, that's kind of their whole shtick is the, lift yourself up by your bootstraps and everyone take care of themselves kind of thing. Right. I get that. But when it comes to state and local governments and the state and local governments that are managing water treatment facilities or, private sector companies that are part of the critical infrastructure that are, the power utilities and the oil industry, et cetera.
Right.
I'm like, okay, on the one hand, not a bad thing for them to have to figure out how to take care of themselves. On the other hand, their defense, their success at defending is crucial to everyone else. So it's like, and if I take that and set it aside from cybersecurity, I also feel the same way about. I also have the sort of the same 6 of one, half a dozen of the other mentality about the unraveling of our alliances with Europe. Now, I think it's horrible for the United States. I think everything that we've done is horrible for the United States. So what we've done with our allies, economically, militarily, strategically, whatever. But if I'm Europe and I'm in the EU, I look at it and I say, maybe this isn't a bad thing. Maybe it's not horrible for us to realize we rely entirely too much on this one nation. And we should have our own defense. We should be able to defend ourselves without the United States. So I think in the end, that will actually play out to be a good thing. Like Canada stepping up and the EU stepping up, that will actually be good for Canada and for the EU. It won't be great for the United States necessarily, but in terms of the global world order, I think it'll be a good thing. But there are consequences because a lot of the things. And so bringing it back to this concept of state and local governments, a lot of the things that were immediately attacked by, Musk and his band of, high school cyber hackers, when they unraveled the, U.S. aid, and they would go through the list and say, oh, we're giving millions here and millions there, and why are we giving all these millions? We're not running a charity here, and it's like they're looking at it through just one pure lens, where they said, hey, let's run a query on this database and start nixing programs. They're not looking at it through the lens of decades of relationship building and decades of intelligence and what that does for us. Like one person might look and say, well, why are we giving $100 million to this nation in Africa for their health? What the fuck? But someone else might say, because we don't want whatever disease is there to spread around the world. Like it benefits us. And, it benefits us for there to be political stability in these foreign nations and to not have revolutions and to not have, because those things all have domino effects that impact supply chains, that impact everything else. So it's like, it was never charity. The United States doesn't do charity on a global scale. The United States does self-serving things. So if we're giving a nation $100 million or $1 billion, whatever we're giving, you have to understand that we did that because it helps us, not because it helps them.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the possibility of that particular African nation might be the primary source for some, natural resource, mineral, precious metals that go into our mobile devices. I mean, I forget the name of the material, but it's apparently a natural resource that enables the touch screen. And, in years past, in the early days of mobile devices and smart devices, there is a huge conflict over what's called conflict minerals. How are these minerals being mined? How are the people being paid? They're being paid by, they're being mined by slaves and all sorts of human rights violations. But I want to back up. You were talking and you mentioned the word defense, and one of the things that every citizen of the country has grown to expect is that the federal government provides defense of the country. And historically, that was, making sure that there wasn't land invasions or air invasions or sea invasions. And it's certainly been, as it extended into the world of the internet, cyber warfare is certainly a thing. All the branches of government have been doing things cyber related for decades. I mean, that was going on when I was there. But that expectation of defense and being at the federal level, I mean, that's where I would take exception to what I was saying myself, that it's somebody else's problem. Security is the way I think of it in terms of cybersecurity, and making sure my organization or my clients are not getting broken into by bad guys is somewhat different than making sure our country is being defended against, other countries, nation states. But clearly the lines have blurred, which, as you were saying, that, maybe this is going to be good for the EU because they've been, lazy and relying on somebody else. I think maybe that's part of the philosophy internal to our country, and maybe, things will be picked up. I mean, the state that I live in, there's all sorts of people talking about recent tax increases that are being put forth and how horrible it is. And the people that are complaining, they're pointing it to it being a Democrat versus Republican thing. But, and this is where I'm not getting it, and there must be more to it, but the Republicans that voted at the federal level for a platform of smaller government and get the federal government out of, their business and pushing states' rights. And so all this stuff is now being pushed out to the state level. Doesn't it make sense as a matter of course then that states are going to have to raise more revenue in order to pay for all these things that the federal government used to be? And why are you blaming a Democratic party that's in office in my state for that, when it's sort of the agenda of the party that's in power right now that you voted for?
Yeah. I mean, I look at some of that stuff, whether it's, kind of the dismantling of the Department of Education and different things, where I say, okay, but if I break this down on what, if you look at an electoral map and you say blue states, red states, and keeping in mind that my own personal philosophy is every state is a purple state. I've done the math on Texas. I've done the math on California. It's like we call Texas red, we call California blue. They're both 55-45, if you break down the actual votes. So it's not that big a difference.
Right. We can round off, we're in a 50-50 country.
Right. But when I look at the blue state, red state, in terms of contribution to GDP and the amount of funding they take from the federal government, generally speaking, the blue states are going to be fine. Like, it's the red states that voted predominantly for this administration that are kind of screwed because they rely on all of this money from the government. Like they're welfare states. And so California could be like, yeah, we're good. We got enough money. We'll be fine. New York's going to be fine. Massachusetts will be fine. But Mississippi, Alabama, they're going to be hurting.
Well, I mean, it's very what we collectively call the flyover states or the Rust Belt. I mean, it's the Midwest, it's the middle countries. Pick your dystopian novel or movie that talks about the powerful city and then all the infrastructure that supports it. I mean, it's playing out before our eyes. And part of me is kind of like, as I read stories or see articles about, people in various Midwestern states being surprised when their neighbors and their friends are getting fired from their government jobs because and I've traveled to all these states, and I get this perception that there's some city in the East, Washington, D.C., where people that don't know me and don't know my business are making decisions about what I can and can't do. Who the hell do they think they are? I get that when I'm there. But I think these people don't realize how much the government is supporting the infrastructure and the economies and their friends and neighbors and themselves in some cases. So it's the blowback and the realization that these people that voted a certain way didn't necessarily realize it was going to impact them. It's I don't want to say I told you so, because I didn't say anything in the first place. Right. But
it is a as the internet memes will tell you, it is a fuck around and find out kind of thing. I was going to say too, this happened and we'll bring this back to tech and cybersecurity in a second, but even in the first administration under Trump, he did the he did some tariffs and some stuff that impacted agriculture, that impacted farmers being able to export, and that caused big problems. And so then on the back end, they ended up granting billions of dollars in to the farmers to basically prop them up. And we're doing that again, where it's like I've seen all kinds of stuff on social media of farmers who voted Republican who are like, oh shit, now this is impacting me. And now I've seen that the administration is talking about again doing subsidies to the farmers, and I'm like, okay, but then I, as not a farmer, as an American citizen going to the grocery store to buy things, what you're telling me is I'm actually paying for this thing twice, because I'm having a cost increase of the goods that I buy because of the tariffs you put in place. And I have a tax increase on the other side to subsidize the farmers for not being able to sell me this produce. And I'm like, so now I'm paying for the same thing twice as an American consumer, all because we decided to shoot ourselves in the foot with, tariffs.
Right. Well, I mean, one thing I was thinking about when you were describing the sort of the rampant cuts and everything that have been made, and now we're seeing reports of people getting rehired because they made mistakes or their algorithms were off. It kind of reminds me of the early days of sort of the public internet, when companies were first starting to plug into the internet and using it as a backbone and trying to figure out how to make money off of connecting to the internet. Frankly, that's about the time I was coming out into the private sector, and we would go out and do vulnerability assessments. We'd do the pen testing and break into these organizations and tell them what all the problems were. But our recommendation at the end of the day was basically, if you're going to be on the internet, you really need to install a firewall and start limiting the traffic. I mean, that's about all there was in terms of security solutions back then, 30 years ago. But there was a lot of pushback and hesitation about putting the firewall in because people didn't know what kind of traffic and activity was happening on their networks, and they didn't know who was doing what because they just didn't have any visibility. And back in those days, we would recommend put in the firewall, lock it down, to only the things that you really know about, and basically just wait for the phone to ring. And when this person calls and is screaming and complaining about they're not able to do something, right, then you decide whether it's a worthy business requirement and whether there's justification. And if there is, punch the hole in the firewall and let them have at it. Don't make that recommendation a whole lot these days because, back in those days, the firewall rules were maybe 20 or 30 lines, whereas, the last time I looked at a firewall rule set, it was tens of thousands of lines, and that's partially because everything's consolidated in now these very powerful network appliances. It's no longer there's a router, there's a firewall, there's a switch, there's 10 routers, there's 100 switches. It's all in one large smart device. But I think the principle, I get a sense that I don't know if anybody's consciously doing it, but it seems like might be what they're doing with the initial pass of just ripping and shredding.
It does. I was going to say, it does seem very much like that's kind of the Doge approach is let's just unplug agencies and see who screams.
Yep.
And then we'll plug them back in as needed, which I don't think is a great way to run a federal government, personally.
Right.
I've never run a federal government, but if I was going to run one, that's not how I would do it. But yeah, so
I was going to, before you shift, I was going to comment. I mean, you sort of set this whole conversation up with a discussion of trust and trusting in the government, not only to provide cybersecurity, but also sort of the adjacent protections that go along with cybersecurity, and it falls into a whole lot of different buckets and categories. And it's interesting to me that for years in the security space and the hacker spaces that we play around in, there's always been a fear of government intervention, fear of government oversight or overreach.
Right.
And I think that contributes a lot, or has contributed a lot, to what's happening. But with very little regard to the several companies that exist these days that are essentially nation state sized, and who we're talking about. People inherently trust the companies and don't trust the government, which I've always thought was a little bit weird, because the government, at least on paper, says we're here to protect and defend you, and we're of the people, by the people, for the people, whereas these nation state sized companies are simply trying to earn revenue and make profit. So, right. Pick your devil, pick your demon. The government that might be a tad run inefficiently, and there might be some bloat and overspending and not so smart spending, but more or less the people are trying to protect you, or a company that more or less just wants your money. Now, on a grand scale, it's all about the money, even at the nation state level, but it's a little bit more subtle at that respect. I just find it fascinating that people pay so much attention to government. It's like a love-hate relationship. We don't want any government intervention until something bad happens. And then, especially in the hacker and security communities, when some of these big vulnerabilities and things have happened over the last couple of years, several times, people are starting to clamor, we need government intervention, we need regulatory compliance, which assumes is coming from the federal government. Imagine 50 different states having 50 different sets of rules for how you engage in commerce, let's say, on the internet.
Right.
We already experience that a little bit at the nation state level when we're trying to satisfy U.S. requirements versus EU requirements, GDPR, data privacy requirements versus U.S. requirements for it. And there's some smattering of states here and there. I guess optimistically, it could provide a whole lot of employment for a lot of cybersecurity people, privacy people, GRC people, policy people. The problem is who's going to pay for it, I guess, and
right.
How much is it going to cost for the consumer to fund all this stuff. I don't quite get how the math all works. I'm not an economist, but I feel like I have steady employment for the next little bit, and selfishly, I'm just trying to work so I can retire.
Right.
I am too scared to look at my retirement savings plans right now.
This isn't a good week to do that.
I'm just going to wait 6 or 9 months or a year and look back and see, wow, that was a huge dip. I don't want to see it when we're hopefully near the bottom of the dip. All that to say is I'm going to be working for quite a while, I think, and I seem to have a job. Yeah,
that's fair. So actually, the thing I was going to shift to actually plays well into that, because I was going to shift to kind of the broader concept of trust in the government, beyond CISA or security, to in years past, in the, well, I'll just say during the Biden administration, if I wanted information about COVID, if I wanted information about whatever health crisis was happening, I would go to the CDC website and I trusted the information there. If I wanted information, about cybersecurity, I trusted CISA. If I,
Right.
So there was a level of trust in these agencies, and that I feel like is very undermined now. Like I see, like when I see what this administration has done with gutting NOAA and the National Weather Service and the CDC and everything else. Well, now even if I see something that says, well, the National Weather Service says blah blah blah, I'm like, okay, but I don't trust the National Weather Service. Like now I'm like, the National Weather Service is a guy with a map and a black Sharpie.
Right.
And I'm like, that's not a reliable source of information.
It's a really hard conversation to have, and it's a hard concept because in as much as we're more or less a 50-50 country, red versus blue, shall we say, we're also very much divided on what we consider to be reliable news sources. And I don't know if I'm a glutton for punishment or just have some weird defect, but I like to watch the news from both sides. And I'm old, so I still watch the news. And I try to avoid news sources that are pushed on me on my electronic technology devices. And I find it fascinating that the 50-50 of the country is following such an extremely different and opposing narrative, and they don't know it for the most part because they only watch whatever respective side they're on's news source, which makes me wonder, for example, who listens to your podcast? Is it all one side or the other? Do you have a mix? Have you ever had demographics? I do a podcast. I guess I wonder the same thing.
I did demographics many years ago. I haven't done it recently.
Yeah. But, like the fact that the director of NSA got fired last week, and that was kind of a huge deal to a lot of people. You go to a particular news source and it's not even mentioned at all. It's like it's never happened. A little bit of a tangent, but I think it's fascinating. I stumbled upon, I think I was on Facebook a week or two ago, and I don't do a lot of scrolling, but I happened to see something that was a podcaster that, what caught my eye was that he had done a segment of this guy's podcast where he was talking to a friend of his. I think they're both would claim to be evangelical Christians. So they, at least one of them was, following this prophetic person that's been appointed by God that is now leading us, or the Antichrist, depending on how you look at it. But what caught my eye was he had this conversation with a friend of his, and because the friend they were just trying to have a serious discussion and still be friends, even though they might not agree on the things. But the guy asked the question of this guy that's a podcaster. He said, "Name one time where that person we're talking about has told a lie." And I thought that was fascinating because on the one side of the media stream, the numbers of lies is like, well, how many times has he opened his mouth?
I was going to say, like, are we just counting the last hour, the last day? Like, how many can I list?
But somebody that only watches the other side's news source and listens to the narrative and things are deliberately not talked about or skewed was really, honestly, they weren't being flippant. They were seriously asking that question. And I thought that was fascinating. The guy thought it was fascinating. He did a whole podcast episode talking about it.
It is fascinating. Like many years ago, kind of during COVID, I have a lot of cousins, and some of my cousins are right leaning, and they would be the ones who would come on and be the, well, don't believe what you hear from the CDC. You have to do your own research. And so we'd have these whole debates where I'd say, how are you doing that exactly? Like, you're not an epidemiologist. You're not, like, you don't know anything. What are you researching? If do your own research means the first YouTube video that comes up, like no, that's not research.
Right.
But in having those conversations, what I would always kind of point to is I say, look, let's assume, we're trying to be objective about this.
Mm-hmm.
If I tell you that here are, say, 20 media sources in the world that are known, respected, established media sources, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, BBC, The Guardian, whatever, ABC, NBC, CBS, all of them, include Fox News, throw them all in there.
Right.
By all means, get a sampling. But if you look at 20 of them and 19 of them are saying one thing, but the one that you watch is saying something different, it's not because the 19 of them are part of some cabal that are doing a conspiracy against you. It's because the source you're listening to isn't correct.
Right. Well, and to tie it into, cybersecurity and technology, and I don't know if both sides would believe this or not, but the people I run with, the hackers and the purists and the hardcore techies, they would acknowledge this. But doing a Google search is even questionable these days because of the algorithms. And I've known this and I've demonstrated this for, I don't know how many years, 6 or 7 or 8 years. But if you and I agree on searching for some topic on Google, and you do a Google search and I do a Google search, we get different results.
Yeah.
And Google's meant to be, we believe it's a source of truth, but the algorithms have trained it to be a source of, well, this is what I think you want to hear, and this is what I think you want to read.
Like 3 years ago, I think it was, I had David Marcus on, and we talked about that because he's a little more right leaning. I'm definitely on the left, and I said, the problem is we can both search for the same thing. We're going to get entirely different results, and so in order for us to even be objective about our research, I need to go do a search on your computer and you need to come do a search on my computer, or we both need to go to a public library and choose a neutral third-party computer or something because the algorithm is customized. I literally just had this come up yesterday. So this was not in my algorithm. It was something that I saw a news story that Snopes debunked a story that was going around on TikTok that about Trump building a 200-foot statue of Jesus in the White House lawn. So I opened TikTok and I said, well, let me see. Now, it was not in my algorithm. Like, it's not showing up for me in TikTok. But I searched and I found it. And there's a ton. There's a ton of them. And it just goes to show. And my wife has TikTok. Like, all of my kids pretty much have TikTok. And we often talk about that. Like, the algorithm is very unique. Like, what I see when I look at TikTok is completely different than what my daughter sees or what my wife sees. And, like, there's some alignment because we share stuff with each other. And, like, when you click on it, that becomes part of your algorithm. But it is very different. It is very, and so to go back to your point, I think is to say you might look at Google, you might look at social media and feel like that's the world, that's reality, but it's really a very subjective, customized, personalized version of reality just for you.
Well, and that's my concern, is that we no longer, the collective we, no longer have a reliable source of objective truth, which is what the journalism in the media of yore purported to be. Going back to the birth of our country, the idea of a free press, the fact that that's mentioned in our Constitution, there needs to be a voice of dissent, there needs to be the privilege or right or liberty of being able to agree and disagree, mostly with the government in power, and that's necessarily part of the equation, which again is another head scratcher that the people running around thinking that we've restored America to some greatness, where if you go back to the birth of our country being rooted in liberty and freedoms and rights of expression. That what's that thing called? The Bill of Rights. Yeah, that's something that came along somewhere along the line. They. There's another problem is we have a they and us mentality.
Right.
There's a portion of our population that purports to be champions of the Bill of Rights and yet are backing wholeheartedly things that are impinging on the same Bill of Rights. Right. And the problem is they don't see it because their source of truth is not at all objective. Well, I jokingly call this the source of truth, by the way.
So I need to start to wind this down. But one thing I wanted to say on that is, so I agree. And once upon a time, I watched a lot more CNN than I do. But I feel like they went so hard trying to be the middle that they lost journalistic integrity, because now you're giving me this like false equivalency where you don't have the balls to just say this is a lie, this is true, and you're just letting everyone speak. And then you've got, I'll admit that, the MSNBCs of the world have a left-leaning slant. And and the thing is, all of that is in my opinion, a function of the 24/7 news cycle and a function of broadcast networks deciding that journalism and media outlets like newspapers deciding that it needed to be a profit center. And so I was telling my wife the other day, I said, for all these years, the right has put up this boogeyman of, George Soros is funding everything. George Soros is the master funder of all things left. Mm-hmm. And which, as far as I can tell, is categorically false. But I said, I would like to see actually George Soros or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or somebody who has the billions, or Mark Cuban, fund a media organization with no profit motive. Like where you can do actual journalism and you're not in it for the money, you're in it for the journalism. Because I feel like that's what has to happen. Like whether you're left or whether you're right, the fact that your journalism, the fact that the news that you're getting is driven by profit motive changes the equation fundamentally. Like I need the journalism to be driven by the integrity of journalism, not by profit motive.
Right. I agree with that. It's hard to play out, because I'm glad we have public broadcasting system, but it gets funded by the government to some degree. Grants, it's great to have all that stuff is what I'm saying, but somebody still has to pay for it because there's costs associated. And so there's always the possibility of the money talks. But yeah, I agree with you with the sentiment, at least, that journalism should be free and independent and unencumbered of the profit motive. I grew up on print media. We used to have these things called newspapers, and I grew up in Maryland, so we had the Washington Post, which was published in the morning, and the Washington Star, which was published in the afternoon. One was left-leaning, one was right-leaning. I didn't care because I knew when I was reading editorials and articles from the left-leaning that it had a left-leaning bias. And so I could sort of take that into account and filter things out. And same with the right side and find sort of the middle ground where there might be some semblance of objectivity of what's really going on. I don't see anybody making the attempt at filtering anymore. And, they're like, I got to only use my one source, and they don't filter, regardless of which side you're on. I still am a proponent of watching both. We watch the news now, and I'm not even talking about the videos. I do the cable television, what I call entertainment media. But whether you're watching it on all the different feeds, and I avoid like the plague trying to watch any of the feeds that are coming to me all the time on my source of truth device from Google or Yahoo or whatever app I'm logging into. I mean, everybody's got a news feed. But to me, that's not news. To me, that's all just political bias slant.
Yeah.
And it's all designed to make money.
Yeah. Well, it's also, and I want to wind this down. So, I told you before we started that I could literally go all day with this stuff. But
Yep.
following the election, my father asked me. He was like, "All right, what do we do? Like what is your source of information?" And I said, "You know what? I don't have a good answer for you on that because of all of the subjective slants. It's a problem." And I said, while everyone's doing their hot takes on, well, the Democrats lost because Israel, Gaza. The Democrats lost because transphobia. The Democrats lost, like whatever the hot take was on like what the hot button issue is. I said, no, I think the larger fundamental issue that we need to really face as a nation, or be resigned to the fall of democracy, comes back to Citizens United and the fact that we rely on information from Twitter, Facebook, Google, and those aren't trustworthy sources of information. They're all algorithm driven, and the algorithm is controlled by someone who's on the right.
Yeah, and that's been going on for how long? But now we're worried about AI taking over. We've been manipulated for the how long have these devices been around now? It's been
18 years. If we go to the iPhone was 2007, I think.
I was going to round it to 20 years, but so be it. The manipulation is there, and it's all for an economic bottom line. They want your money, and if you're resigned to that, I still chuckle at the people I talk to. They get so enraged about government oversight, and yet they're like, "Oh, there's a new iPhone coming out, must buy." Apple does more stealing your data than the government ever has or ever will, because Apple's got more money to spend on doing it. And same with the other big nation state sized companies that are out there. But we're okay with that as long as we get a coupon or a good deal.
Yep.
So.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me. Like, it's a fun.
Yeah, this got me all depressed. I think I'll go drink a brown liquor.
Yeah, I was gonna say, have to switch from the Red Bull to the Bullet.
There you go.
All right. Take care.
All right. Had fun, sort of.
I appreciate you investing your time to listen to the podcast, but I also invite you to engage on social media. Please go like our Facebook page and follow at TechSpective on Twitter and Instagram. You can feel free to let me know what you like, let me know what you don't like, let me know if you love it, let me know if it sucks, and let me know what products you'd like to see reviewed or what questions you'd like to see answered in future posts.